Thanks so much for joining us today. If you're just joining us, please make sure and select your language and then also click mute original audio so you don't hear two languages at once. I'm Jennifer Lucas with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, and I'm glad you all could take the time to be here today. And before we get started, as I said, make sure to make your language selection. And you should have received instructions in an email prior, either yesterday or this morning from me, about how to choose your language and also some additional information about this presentation and accompanying handouts. So some things to know about are, first of all, this is our second webinar in the summer series that we're doing on special education. We realized there was a need for parents to understand their special education rights, especially in light of what's going on and what's happened with the school closures and distance learning and a great deal of uncertainty about what's happening in the fall. And so it's important for all of us, a number of us today, presenting our parents ourselves of students with IEPs, and it's important for all of us to know our rights as we navigate this time. Our first webinar was in June, and that focused on the importance of data collection, as well as an overview of compensatory services. Each of the webinars are being recorded, and I send out a link to the people who register after the webinar is over, so that they have access to the recording and can go back and listen to it at their leisure. Unfortunately, the recordings are only in English. That's how Zoom allows the recordings to occur. They only occur of the presenter talking and not the language channel. So apologies for that. So you can see from the little housekeeping that we already have you guys muted, so that should minimize the distractions. If you haven't received the PowerPoint from us yet, you will be receiving it in the next few days. You can ask questions using the chat feature, and we will either respond to you as we receive them or respond to you at the end during the Q&A section of the webinar. And for any questions we're not able to get to, we will definitely be able to follow up with you guys later, and you'll have our contact information. It's on the last slide. So feel free to follow up with any of us regarding any specific questions that we're not able to have time to address. Quick blurb on State Council. I'm with State Council on Developmental Disabilities, and we're a state federal agency that assures people with developmental disabilities and their families get the services and supports they need. There are 12 of our offices around the state, and I know many people who registered for this webinar today were from various counties throughout the state. So just know that wherever you are, there actually is a one of our offices that covers your county and your area. And it's a good idea to contact them and sign up for any trainings or resources they may have going on in their area as well. And the website for State Council is the last bullet point here, and you can go on there and find out about the offices. So who's presenting today? Mary Paetzo is a special education advocate in Monterey County. Jonathan Gush is a special education teacher who's in private practice down in Ventura County. I'm with State Council, the Central Coast office, and Stella Lauerman is a Spanish interpreter and many other things too in Monterey County. So appreciate everyone being here, appreciate to our presenters and this collaborative effort in getting the summer series going and educating parents about their rights. And just one last thing before we dive in too far. After the presentation's over, we will have a very short poll that I will ask a few questions. You'll see pop up on your screen. You just can respond quickly to those questions. And then we will also dive into the Q&A portion of this presentation. Each of our webinars is set up to have about 30 to 45 minutes of presentation and then 30 to 45 minutes of Q&A time. All right, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And for welcome to everybody that's joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us and gain a little bit of an insight on the IEP process. And that's where we're starting this summer series. We've talked amongst ourselves and we really thought, you know, instead of just jumping the gun, we need to cover the entire assessment process from the beginning, which leads to the IEP process, which is the end results. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about how we gather information on our students' performance. And we're going to kind of go over the process itself, what some of the assessments look like in order to give you an understanding of what assessments do and how to use them in the IEP process. So typically, when you see your teacher in the fall for your child, you will be talking about many, many different types of assessment results. It's kind of this generic word that talks about many different options. So the first option that a teacher might be talking about is the in-classroom assessments. And these are the tests that the teacher gives in the classroom to see how well their teaching is working. So it could be a spelling test at the end of the week. It could be a math quiz for the day. Some teachers really like exit tickets. Those are really informal assessments just to make sure children are getting it. And all those should really build up to progress checks. So this could be an end of the year assessment done by a teacher. It could be the test from the textbook. A lot of districts are also designing their own assessments as well, just to kind of get their own pulse reading on how the district is doing. Some school districts will call this multiple measure assessments. And really what all these are gearing up to is, well, how well is a student gearing up towards meeting those state standards? And this is kind of the basis of a special education referral process. And I know a lot of the families here probably already have their child in special education, but I do want to start here because a lot of the times you'll see this question on assessment plans: has a child received intervention services already? And this is part of that intervention process. Some districts call it multi-tiered support. Some districts call it a response to intervention. But basically, districts are trying to branch out and provide services for intervention before special education services. And there's pros and cons to this method, such as districts trying to delay assessments. But the intent of the law was to try and get students supports sooner rather than later. Is that always carried out? No, especially with the distance learning model we've been stuck in. It's been very complicated. This leads up to state testing, which is the official state measurement of student progress towards standards. Many of you probably realize this was canceled for the prior school year. Again, because of distance learning, it was just decided from the federal government that the federal government would waive this, the testing requirement, and that trickled down into the states. The state of California has two major assessments that it gives. The first one is the CASP. And as I go through today, you'll notice there's a lot of acronyms in these assessment discussions. The CASP stands for the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress. And the website is at casp.org. And this is the state assessment to see how well students are doing on the state standards. This test has really no bearings on your child's ability to go back and forth between different grade levels. If there's promotion, retention, or even special education, its sole purpose is really reporting numbers to the state and to the federal government. It should be part of a special education assessment just to look at the numbers to see where the IEP team and the assessment should have a conversation and where they're starting from. But other than that, it really doesn't have any impact on any other assessments. The second assessment that the state gives is a rather new assessment, and is the English Language Proficiency Assessment for California, or the ELPAC. And this is the new language development survey test. It is now an end of the year, or almost end of the year test, compared to the CELT, which was the California English Language Development Test that was administered as an incoming survey. So now we're kind of seeing, well, what was the annual progress going year to year? So this is the starting point that we have. And from that, we kind of gear up and go, well, are our children making progress towards general education? Yes or no? And if we see this continual lack of progress, what are we going to do about it? Okay, next slide, please. So if you have a child that is not making progress repeatedly, usually you want to have about 6 weeks to 8 weeks of an intervention tried before you request any special education assessment. You want to seek out a document that looks like this. This is an assessment plan that gears up the whole process of assessment. And this is basically a contractual document that you are entering with the school district to formally assess your child. And we do this when there is concern that a disability affects your child's progress to access their general education curriculum. And the school districts do have an obligation to be on the lookout for students with disability. This is usually referred to child find or search and serve under IDEA. And schools are obligated to actively search out for students with possible disabilities. That does not stop the parents from being concerned about their children and then going out and asking for their own assessment from the school district. And there also is progress monitoring here as well. Students already in special education have to have assessments every 3 years to check on progress and to maintain eligibility for special education services. And we'll come back and talk about eligibility in a couple weeks as well. The next question is, well, how do we really get this process going? So anytime there is a concern for a disability, whether it be from a parent, a teacher, or a student study team, once there is a recommendation for assessment, you have 15 days to get an assessment plan delivered to you. It needs to be provided in a language you can understand. So if you need translation, you're entitled to translation, regardless of the language, regardless if it's written or verbal, you need to be able to understand it. The other option, unfortunately, is the district says no. Typically, we don't see this happening all that often. It's really easy for a district to assess and say that a child does not qualify, rather than just totally assess, refuse the assessment. Mary, at the end of this conversation, will talk about IEEs, or independent educational evaluations, but we will actually go on to prior written notice and due process on our last webinar, or second to last webinar, when we explore options here. Now, the tricky part of this is our current situation. The federal guidelines do say that assessments need to be completed in 60 days, with the exception of vacations longer than 5 days. And we're kind of stuck just like you are. We're kind of waiting to see what the new school year will be, but school districts may not intentionally hold out on assessing students. We're very aware of that. We're reaching out to state offices and school districts to make plans too. But typically within 60 days, you have to have an IEP meeting to review the results of this assessment plan. And if you're looking at an assessment plan and you see mistakes on it, do not write anything on the assessment plan, cross it out, or make any changes. You need to ask for a new assessment plan. Maybe they forgot to leave off, or they left off a health assessment and it needs to be on there, or they promised a functional behavior analysis and it's not on there. Do ask for a completely new assessment plan before you sign it. Okay, next slide, please. So rather than go into all the ins and outs of the assessments themselves, I just wanted to give a little background information on what our normed assessments are. And I can't go into exact details of every single test because they are copyrighted and protected pieces of information. As a professional myself, I don't want the test questions to get out because that would invalidate the test. Like, you could study for it, and that would end up hindering the process more than helping. So typically you'll see school personnel carrying around like little bags like this. It looks like we're carrying fancy laptop bags, but they're not. They're filled with the test materials themselves. And what they look like is we have these little fancy easels. They usually stand up. So I can present information to the student, and I would have information pop up so I can see it, what it is the child's supposed to do and what acceptable responses are. And these tests are typically delivered in a one-on-one setting. There are some circumstances, like maybe there's a one-to-one paraprofessional for health support, and that would still be allowed. So as the proctor would start giving the test, you would have other things like a testing protocol. So you guys may have seen little pamphlets like this brought into IEP meetings, and the presenters at the IEP might be drastically trying to flip the pages, figuring out what the answers were to different questions. But this is just a place where we mark answers, what is correct, what is not, based upon the student answers. And ultimately, what this ends up to is utilizing data tables in the back to come up with different test scores based upon a child's age or grade for comparison. And it's that comparison that we're trying to get to. And again, trying to avoid a big, long statistics conversation, I do have a picture of a bell curve there in the bottom right-hand corner for you to look at. And the idea behind these assessments is to figure out, well, where does a child fall in the complete range of the people that first took this test? Every test has different lengths of time that it was given to different people for the sample and different ages and grades. So that's something really important to consider. Are they giving a preschool test to a high schooler? Not appropriate. So do ask that question, you know, who is allowed to take this test and report scores for it. When we get these scores, it allows us to compare apples to apples. So even as I showed you a math test, the numbers that it will give out are comparable to test scores from the speech pathologist to the school psychologist. They allow easy communication between all professionals in the room, the entire IEP team, including you, the parents, to judge performance, see where there's areas of strength and areas of concern that need to have goals. So as you can kind of see on this bell curve, there's a cluster towards the middle. And it's that middle that comprises the average range of scores. So the further you are away from the middle, the lower or the higher the numbers. Unfortunately, California and special education law only covers students on the lower side. Gifted and talented is not a qualification for special education. It is a separate general education program. With all this information, we do have to be careful that these tests, and I'm showing you a math assessment here, Key Math 3, the numbers that we get don't correspond to grade level standards or grade level expectations. So if you hear your child performed at the 5th grade level, it's not that that's the 5th grade curriculum. Your child scored like other 5th graders that took the test. Same thing with the age equivalency. If they say your child scored at a 10-year, 5-month level, it has no bearings on what other 10 years old should be doing. It is just saying how they're comparing to other students. And the other thing that goes with this is the standard scores and percentile ranks. The standard scores typically range from 75 to 150. Each test is slightly different, but the closer the score is to 100 is the closer to the average your child is. Lastly, there's the percentile rank, and that ranges from 1 to 99. Sometimes it goes down to 0.01% and 99.99%. And that is a comparison of where the test taker is compared to the entire sample. So that can be a useful comparison. It's typically something that is the most comprehensible to parents without a lot of statistical analysis here. And I just saw a question regarding should parents fill this out. This is a protocol for the examiner for this specific math test. So this would be specific to the test that I'm giving, which would be a one-on-one assessment between me and the child. There are other tests that do have supplemental questionnaires that would go home to the parents. Okay. All right, next slide, please. So the question is, well, why do we do this? And truly it is to get a one-time snapshot of a child's performance that is unbiased as possible, so we can make some judgments of where a child actually is. And unfortunately, special education does require labeling for qualifications. And even in private practice, we do have to deal with this issue. So what you see on the screen right now is actually a quote from law that basically says we have to do this as IEP team members, and we should do it well with multiple tests, not just one test that tells us everything to determine where a child is performing. And based on that, we can look at the numbers and see where a child may qualify for education. And each one of these categories does have its own qualification requirements. I'm not really going to go into those today. Again, I'm anticipating most people here are actually or have their child already in special education, but all these areas should be discussed if they're an area of concern, and it is an IEP team decision. Where this is getting interesting is there are some assessments that are actually being allowed to be administered virtually. And I'm still waiting to see if the state of California is going to allow this. I know some charter schools are already using virtual special education services, and they are being accepted professionally. However, you know your child best. If you know your child needs a lot of one-on-one support and a lot of in-person direction with support, it may not be a valid measure of your child's actual performance in a virtual setting. So we do have to go back and forth on what is the best results that you're going to get. If the district does push for a virtual assessment, I would say the best thing is to let it happen. And if you think the results do not reflect your child's true abilities, then Mary, at her section, will be talking about how to gain an independent educational evaluation, which is where the school district may compensate you for an outside evaluator to do a different assessment, such as getting a second opinion from the doctor. Okay, all right. One more point before we move on. An assessment plan measures areas of need, not the actual diagnosis. So when you think of a child with autism, we're not going to say, oh, we need a test for autism. We're going to break everything down. What is their language needs? What are their academic needs? Do they have motor skill needs? So the assessment plan does not assess for the labels of special education, but really the individual domains that need to be assessed. Okay, next slide, please. So the next few slides are here for reference for everybody to look at. I do have the different domains of an assessment plan here, as well as some example tests. Now, when you do develop an assessment plan with the school, the major point of focus is the domains that you want to test. The assessors themselves have the professional capacity to determine what tests best suit your child's needs for assessment. And even for me in private practice, I might say I'm going to assess a child's reading skills, but until I know where the child's strengths and weaknesses are, I don't know fully what assessments I may use. So we do go a little bit more generic first, so we don't exclude anything by accident, and also leave that professional judgment up to that professional. And that would be true in both the school district, and if you go outside the school district to get an evaluation, we would say, okay, the professional is choosing these instruments here. So typically the first thing to be assessed is a child's intellectual development. And this is basically cognition and memory. So the old concept of IQ, or intelligent quotient, basically says, let's take how well a person processes information, uses it to problem solve, and manages their memory, and take this all into one number. So it does roll a lot of information into one single number. That is still the unfortunate de facto norm. There are different people trying to push for other measures of success. There's a big push for language tests to be just as valid as an IQ score. But there again, we also have people on the autism spectrum that have very limited language that are also very intelligent as well. So we do have competing theories, competing needs. Again, this is where hopefully the professional judgment comes in, and the assessor of this area will balance the needs of the assessment with the needs of the child. Once an IQ test is given, the psychologist may look into processing tests. So this is within a learning disability assessment, where there might be a visual motor integration test, how well a child writes, what they can see, a phonological processing test, how well a child handles sounds, a auditory processing test, what the brain actually does with those sounds, as well as executive functioning, which measures intelligence and problem solving. Memory tests are specifically the domain of a psychologist. So I'm going to mind my professional limitations as a special education teacher. I don't give memory tests, but basically those tests look at how well a person handles information in their head, such as thinking of the digits of a phone number to dial versus committing those digits to memory. Oh yeah, what's my grandma's phone number? It would assess both those facets of memory. And then a school psychologist may also initiate nonverbal assessments. I think these assessments are very important to look into anytime there is concern over a child's language ability. So it could include families that are bilingual or just immigrated to the country and are monolingual in a language other than English. These assessments try to take all the language out of assessment and really judge what a child's potential to solve problems looks like. So if you have concerns over language bias, do talk to the school psychologist and the IEP team about nonverbal assessments. Another domain here is self-help and adaptive skills. And these are typically checklists that go out to the parents, maybe other professionals on campus, other teachers, your current teacher, maybe even the last year's teacher, just to see how well they function at home and in the classroom. So it could be, does your child remember homework? Do they turn the homework in when they get to the classroom? Can they go to the bathroom? Can they make a request to go to the bathroom? Do they know how to schedule going to the bathroom? And these are the very, very, very long checklists that I think most of us have experienced at one point. This assessment does pop up anytime a child has difficulty with self-regulation in the classroom, trying to figure out what their needs are. And again, for older students at the transition level, once they're almost done with their high school setting at age 16. All right, next slide, please. Another area of assessment is speech and language. And again, I'm not a speech pathologist. I do admire their work. They're amazing people. Speech pathologists really have several different domains that they will assess. So when you develop an assessment plan, you may want to discuss with a speech pathologist exactly what domains they will be assessing. The first domain is articulation, and that is how well a child says their sounds. So you might have children that don't pronounce the which is the TH blend. Some children may have difficulties with their R's, some with their S. They will work with your child to pronounce those sounds correctly. This is usually a quick in and out, a year or so of speech pathology and articulation therapy usually will help that child. And typically those children are found in preschool and kindergarten, the primary grades, and serviced. That may also translate over into language issues, which is expressive and receptive languages that take a look at how well children are able to understand words that are said to them and what vocabulary they use to express what is going on. This area is rather large and affects pretty much every academic subject there is, including math now with the new Common Core math standards. So if there is any language concerns, do talk with the speech pathologist on how language needs pop up in the classroom and truly what supports are needed based off the assessment results. Another domain of assessment for the speech and language pathologist is the pragmatics and social skills. And this is basically how well do we work in communication without using words. So it could be body language, tone of voice, volume of voice, and many other areas that make communication easier between people. That falls under the speech pathologist, as well as social skills. So those could be your social novellas. It could be social skills, direct instruction in the classroom, in the community. A speech pathologist would be the one to assess that. And an interesting domain here for some of our families is the augmentative communication and assistive technology. So this could be for our students who are nonverbal and need some kind of augmentative communication device, such as an iPad that has little pictures that a child can type on to compose a sentence, or maybe it is just even the keyboard themselves and they can start typing out words to communicate. Here in Ventura County, in our Ventura County SELPA, we actually have a team that comprises of a speech pathologist and occupational therapist that works to complete these assessments. I have assistive technology here as well. There are little devices for even computers and pencils that just makes using these devices easier and manageable as well. So that kind of straddles back and forth between motor skills and speech needs as well. Academics is obviously the crux of education. This is where a special education teacher will come in and measure all the domains of education: reading, writing, language use, spelling, mathematics. This is the bulk of assessment. And I make a note here that there's basically two types of assessments for academics. The first is like the entire battery assessments, like the Woodcock-Johnson, the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, and the Westchester Individual Achievement Test. These tend to be the all-in-one deal where they assess all the different subjects in one test. They by no means the only test that you can pull from. There are in fact many different local area assessments, and like I showed you here, this is the key math test. This test takes a really deep look at math skills from pretty much elementary ages all the way up until Algebra 1. And if I have a child that has a really interesting math profile, I might take the time to give him this or her this test to really get a full picture of mathematics. Similarly, I have just reading tests and just writing tests that do a more thorough job that answers, well, why is this child not performing as well as they should be? What's holding them back? So as you hear the assessment results from the assessment report, do ask, well, why did my child get such a low score? What's holding him back? What's there? Because that will help give information to develop accommodations, to keep on moving forward with creating a plan. All right. Next I have on here is motor skills. That is part of fine motor and gross motor skills. So for example, an adaptive PE teacher for gross motor, an occupational therapist for fine motor, and they come in and evaluate how your child's motor coordination will be able to help them function in learning, and determine what services may be necessary to help them access their education. Next slide, please. And we have some other assessments that are not always used, but they are very important as well. Starting when a child turns 16, or whenever an IEP will be developed for their child's 16th birthday, we do have to consider secondary planning. And that's where we figure out, well, what kind of schools would a child like to go to? Colleges, universities, or just even general job placement. And we do have tests for that as well. What kind of skills does your child have? What kind of job may they want? What kind of skills would they have to learn for that job? And what also goes with that is independent living as well. Does a child want to have their own apartment? Do they want to live in a group home? What skills do they have? Can they take care of themselves? And what skills do we need to teach them, like going to a grocery store? All those assessments help us determine how to support a child moving up and graduating from high school, as scary as that can be. The topic du jour, especially with the COVID crisis, is also social emotional. And these services are there for children who have profound mental health needs in order to access the curriculum. And this area is a challenge. I have many school districts that will only do a social emotional assessment for children that are already in special education, which is a problem. If you feel your child has any mental health needs, please reach out to your school district right away to start the documentation process. And in the fall, do reach out and you can ask for a social emotional assessment. And this will let a therapist, usually a licensed marriage and family therapist, they will take care of looking into your child's needs. And the data from this assessment tends to be a little bit difficult because there is confidentiality between the child and the therapist that typically is not breached. But you will get information upon a possible concern, like maybe anxiety, depression, some phobias could come out of that. This assessment tends to avoid the medical diagnosis, like a bipolar disorder. But do reach out as soon as possible if you have these concerns to start that documentation. Within social emotional assessments, we may also go a little bit more generic too, and just offer assessments to check for autism symptoms. The Connors rating scale is just kind of a general screener that a school psychologist will administer just to check to see if there are any mental health concerns. And there are a few others like the BASC, which just give general information about the need for, again, possible further assessment. We do have a couple others on here. The district nurse must come in and check your child's hearing and vision for basic functionality. There are other assessments, such as a developmental optometry assessment, an auditory processing assessment, that could provide further details. So do discuss those if there are other concerns, as well as behavioral assessments for one-to-one aids, as well as functional behavior assessments for behaviors that we don't quite understand what the purpose is. Next slide. And this slide is just here to kind of summarize everything. You're entitled to a report. You can ask for a draft report, but it may be missing some pages on the discussion of qualification for special education, because that does need to happen at the IEP. But all in all, it's really important to remember that the specialists, not the actual assessments, diagnose children. So assessments are here to provide that big picture so we know what actions we should be taking based off the information. So here there's a list of just some general thoughts, that there should be some discussion of why there are low scores, why there are concerns for your child. And we want to start building those connections. And we'll be having that conversation next week when we talk about how you should be writing accommodations based off of these results. We also need to be looking into why behaviors are there. Behaviors are communicative, or your child trying to tell you something's wrong when they don't know how to say it. And if there are any major differences between what a child does in the classroom, does at home versus does in the assessment, you need to have a conversation there. And last but not least, even as we're in this webinar, take time to think through and process the information. A psychoeducational report, I've seen one more than 50 pages. You are not able to read 50 pages and understand 50 pages at a 2-hour IEP. Take it home, read it, sign in attendance only for the IEP, and think through everything. All right, next slide, please. And Mary, this is your section about what to do if you feel a school assessment is not appropriate.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. And yes, as you said, Jonathan, parents should definitely not sign the IEP at the IEP meeting. Take it home, review it, and make sure it says what you think that it says before you sign it. And if it doesn't, you can always sign with exception, and you can note your parent concerns. And then that way they can at least start to implement the parts of the IEP that you agree with, while you try to hammer out the other parts of it that were either left out or that you don't agree with. So we're going to move on and talk about independent education evaluations at public expense. What that is it's an independent evaluation conducted by a neutral third party at public expense. What that means is that if you disagree with the evaluation that the district has done on your child, you have the right to request that a neutral third party do another evaluation at the district's expense and have the district pay for it. Usually this person has at least the same qualifications as the person who conducted the evaluation for the district. For example, districts have school psychologists assess your child, and speech therapists usually, and occupational therapists. And those people all have certain credentials. So whoever does the independent evaluation on your child must have those same credentials. They can have more credentials than the minimum ones that the district assessors have, but they can't have less. So, and usually when you request an independent evaluation at public expense, the district will respond and give you a list of pre-approved providers to do those evaluations. I recommend that you do your homework and look up these pre-approved providers to make sure that they are familiar with your child's disability and to make sure that they're going to do a thorough evaluation for you and give you new information. And parents also do not need to use someone who is on that pre-approved list. You can go out and find your own qualified professional to do the assessment, but you need to get district approval. Once you find that person, you should have a conversation with your special ed director and say, this is who I want to use. And then usually they have to get board approval. They have to get it on the board's agenda and have the board approve it at a board meeting before you can move forward with getting the assessment done. So there is a process involved with that to be aware of. And it's good to look out even beyond your own community to see who's out there who knows, knowledgeable people about your child's diagnosis, and that can give you good information. Okay, next slide, please. And if you disagree with the district's evaluation, you must request the independent evaluation in writing, and they will get back to you in writing as well, hopefully with something that's called prior written notice. Anytime a district does something that you don't want done or says no to something, they must give you prior written notice and state why they're refusing your request or granting it. And things to consider when you're looking at the district's assessment, if you just disagree with the information or the diagnosis, or if they find your child ineligible for an IEP, all you have to do is tell the district that you disagree with their assessments. You do not have to give them a reason why. They can ask you why. They have that right, but you do not have to tell them the reason why. You can just simply say, I just disagree with your assessments. And other things too is look at, was the assessment sufficiently comprehensive? Did it test your child in every area of suspected disability? If your child has, let's say, a medical diagnosis of autism and they didn't do a speech evaluation for social skills training, but he or she is functioning at grade level and the school's saying, no, he doesn't qualify for an IEP, or we're not going to give your child social skills training because he's doing fine academically, then you have a right to request a speech evaluation at public expense, even if they did not test in that area, because it is a suspected area of disability and they had the right to test in that area and they didn't do it for whatever reason. And then also, as Jonathan was saying, they can't make any determinations based on one test alone. So did they use more than one test? And also, was it conducted in the native language of the child? If the child's primary language is Spanish and maybe the child has some English ability, but isn't quite fluent in English yet, and the test was given in English, that's going to affect the child's scores. So you want to find a bilingual assessor to do it in both English and Spanish to make sure that it's not just a language barrier issue. And also, did the testing include observations in all the settings at school? Did the assessor go observe the child in the classroom? Was the child observed on the playground? Things like that. Was the child observed during lunchtime? And playground time and lunchtime are both highly unstructured times in a student's school day. So you might see different behaviors in those areas than you would in the classroom. Okay, next slide, please. And do I have to allow the district a second chance to do their comprehensive testing? That answer is no. They are supposed to test in every area of suspected disability. There has been a guidance letter issued by the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education, that says that if a district doesn't test in an area like speech or OT, and a parent comes back and says, well, why didn't you test in that area? You should have. I'm seeing language issues in my child. You can request an independent evaluation at public expense in that area because the district had the first right to do it, and for whatever reason they chose not to. So next slide, please. How to request an IEE. And I think, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, you're going to be mailing out or emailing out to everybody a sample of how to request an IEE.
Right. So actually, I did email out to everyone who registered for this. I emailed out a letter template, both Spanish and English, on how to request an IE. Everyone should have received it.
Great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, the request must be made in writing. Even if you make the request verbally at an IEP meeting, you still must give it to them in writing. You could even just write out a simple note on a piece of notebook paper at the IEP meeting and give it to the team, because that starts the clock for them to respond to it. And IDEA and the California Ed Code both do not have a hard and fast deadline on getting a district response to your IEE request. It says that the district must respond within a reasonable amount of time, but they don't define what reasonable is. I have found that the California Department of Education finds 30 days to 6 weeks to be a reasonable amount of time. So if you wait a month and you don't get a response, you can you can file a compliance complaint with the California Department of Education. And I think at the end of the slides, there's a website where you can go to get that information. And because anytime you request an IEE, the district either must approve the request for the independent evaluation, or they must take you to administrative hearing, and then the burden of proof is on them to show why their assessments were adequate. And sometimes, you know, I've seen both happen. But then, you know, that's pretty, if the district, you know, didn't test in an area of suspected disability and you request an IEE, then chances are they're probably going to grant the IEE and not take you to hearing. But if they do nothing and just, you know, hope that you go away, then they are out of compliance, and that they're in violation of IDEA and the California Ed Code. So compliance complaints are pretty easy to file. They're pretty self-explanatory, but, you know, keep a copy of your written request for the IEE, because you'll need to include that with your compliance complaint to show that you did request it and the date that it was requested. And sometimes too, you can always follow up with your special ed director and just shoot them an email and say, hey, I requested this on such and such date. I haven't received a response. When can I expect a response? So that's an option too. Okay, next slide. And then your right to a prior written notice. As I said before, anytime a district grants permission for something that you ask for or denies permission, again, they have to give you what's called prior written notice. It's usually a letter. Sometimes it's both emailed and mailed via certified mail to the parent that informs you about their decision, and usually gives the reason and logic behind their decision. And sometimes gives other options. If they say no, then sometimes I'll come back and say, we're denying this, but we're offering you this. And then they usually send, well, they're supposed to send a copy of your notice of procedural safeguards that you get at every IEP meeting, or at least get offered at every IEP meeting, with the prior written notice. So if you don't get that, then you can also file a compliance complaint for that, because they're supposed to give you prior written notice. And it has to describe the actions proposed or refused and tell you why, and describe any records or reports that were used to reach that decision, and then a statement that you as a parent of a child with a disability have protections under the procedural safeguards. So if you've never read them, you should. And then other sources for you to obtain assistance if you have questions. And then, as I said, other options that the IEP team considered. So next slide, please. Questions. Do I have to give the district a reason for requesting an IEE? The only reason that you have to give them is that you disagree with their evaluations. And that's it. And they will, if they push you on that, just keep saying, I disagree with your evaluations. Do I have to use a provider from the list the district provides me? That answer is no. You can go out and find your own, but as I said, you need to get it approved by the district before you get the evaluation done. How long do I have to wait until I get my IEE? That depends. It usually moves faster if you use somebody that's on the pre-approved list, but as I said, it's a good idea to go out and find your own and make sure that you have the right person to give you good information. So it can take a couple months, 2-3 months. It also depends on the availability of the assessor. What can I do if they ignore my request? You can either file a compliance complaint, like I said, or you can let them know in writing that you have found an assessor and you're moving forward with the assessment. They haven't responded to your request, and you're going to be seeking reimbursement from the district for the cost of the assessment. So that's an option too, but you need to give them that in writing. And then what are the district's options when I request an IEE? They either have to grant it or take you to administrative hearing and then show that their assessments were adequate. So next slide. I think we covered prior written notice. Can you go back to that last slide for a minute? Because there was one other thing I wanted to talk about.
Is this the one you want, Mary, or the one before?
Yes. No, this one.
Okay. Sorry. I think I went backwards. This one?
No, but that's okay. I think
Okay.
the slide before this one, there was a note that that districts do have the right to put limitations on independent evaluations, such as costs and location. I have found that some districts put unrealistically low costs on what they'll approve for independent evaluations. If that is the case with you, what I recommend that you do is call around 2 assessors that are both in and out of your area, because Monterey County, we don't have a lot of people in Monterey County who act as independent assessors, and a lot of times parents have to go to Santa Cruz or San Jose or San Francisco to get the assessments that their child needs. And districts they do put cost and location limitations on those, but if you can show that the cost limitation is not market value for what assessments cost, sometimes you can get them to increase that. Okay, and then I think the last slide has the website for filing a compliance complaint with the California Department of Education. Okay, next one.
Hey, thanks, Mary.
Whew, made it.
Yeah, you covered that in record time. So now we're going to address some of the questions that came in through the registration process. We received quite a few, and also try to get to any questions we haven't yet answered in the chat box as well. Jonathan, do you want to start, or do you want me to start with some questions?
Sure, I can go ahead and touch on a couple. I saw a similar question come in about functional behavior assessments, sometimes abbreviated FBA. These assessments are done to help us better understand why a child will engage in behaviors rather than be communicated verbally. And they can be there for any number of reasons. And a FBA might be stopped right now if the behavior only happens in the classroom or at school, in part because children were not allowed under public health orders to go back to school. If there are still concerns, like the behavior is still happening at home and the community is generalized, then by all means do work with the school personnel to finish it. There is no special secret form of an FBA. It's pretty much all data collection of like when it happens, where it happens, what was going on before, what did you do afterwards. And it's that analysis by the school psychologist or the behavior specialist that really constitutes that FBA. So anybody can really collect information for an FBA with a little help on what it is you're doing. The question that we got through the registration did mention that their child was hesitant to return to school in the fall. And I will say, do be careful with that. If there is a medical need, you definitely want to have that documented by your child's doctor to stay compliant with the compulsory attendance laws of the state of California. And if there is a doctor's note, that might qualify your child for home hospital teaching.
And Jonathan, can I interject right there?
Sure.
I was listening to something on the radio recently, this morning actually, and they were talking about how a lot of schools will be offering that option because some students might have immune compromised parents at home. There's all sorts of reasons why distance learning or online instruction might be something they would do 100% of the time. So it just sounds like, I think by the time our August webinar rolls around, that's what we're hoping, the August 8th one or 7th one, we'll have some clarification around exactly what's going on, although it does vary by county and district, but at least we'll have more information to share. But yeah, I think there's different ways of doing it, and it might be that some children are just gonna be doing all online based on their family's need.
Right, and I think too, here in the state of California, every school district is making its own choices whether or not to reopen. So from the federal government, including the president, we're hearing some threats being made to withhold funding and everything. It is a local choice within every school district to reopen or not. So do communicate with your local school district, share your concerns. The president, as the executive of the United States, has no constitutional authority to make decisions on education. And within that too, I think it's important to clarify some vocabulary. I even see some school districts confusing vocabulary. Homeschooling in the state of California is when a family subsidizes and does their own educational program. They'll have to file an affidavit with the state to create their own private school, but that's when they receive no outside assistance from any school district nor charter school. And that kind of contrasts with home hospital teaching, which is a doctor's note for special education services to be delivered only in the home or in a hospital. And there's been some discussions of what that means for students that have COVID, how they can participate remotely, or even if it's safe to service students at home with COVID. There is discussion there, but home hospital teaching is a placement based upon doctor's recommendation. And that takes us to distance learning, remote education, learning at home. That is a policy school districts have developed because of the public health orders to cancel in-person school activities. Within this too, I want to reiterate, assessments have not stopped due to the shutdown of schools. There were some waivers for the prior school year, but nothing has been set for the 2020-2021 school year. So we are hoping that assessments can be completed. I have seen resources from Pearson educational assessments of how to safely administer a test with like a student using their pencil to point or providing the student with a glove, personal protective equipment. So I think there could be some ways to get some one-on-one assessment happening in person. Also, to stay compliant, you can also recommend a record review where everybody just looks at what has been done, what the current performance levels are, and then come back when appropriate and when safe to do the assessments in person if you feel virtual assessment is not going to work for your child. We also got a question for a school over assessing a child. And yes, that is a thing, and we do need to be mindful of the stress of assessment, and that's even part of the special education consideration, that a child has to be pulled out away from their friends, away from the general education class to be assessed and if services if necessary. So you do want to be careful about that. Normed assessment results are considered valid for about a year. Sometimes tests say 6 months. But if you're constantly reassessing for the same thing with the same assessments, something's not working. You might want to consider a behavioral assessment, a social emotional assessment, even a fine motor assessment to try and figure out, well, what are the child's needs? What is not happening? There could be a basic problem that nobody knows about. I was at a school years ago when it was discovered that a third grader was hard of hearing, and that's why he was not paying attention to the teacher. So these mistakes do happen, and we should look into other areas first rather than giving it the same reading test 3 times in a row.
Jonathan, you want me to go ahead and respond to a couple questions that I got
Sure.
to? So one parent had asked, what can I do if I ask for a new evaluation for my child? How can I help my 3-year-old son who has an IEP and needs language help and is hyperactive? And the first thing I want to point out as the parent, you are an expert on your child. So you come with your own expertise about your child. You know your child the most. You've spent the most time with your child, and you can tell when a child is struggling. But as parents, we're generally not professionals in those specific fields, and that's where assessments come in. As an expert on your child, though, it's important to share those concerns with the school. So the school needs to hear about that, and they need to hear about it in writing. So if you have those concerns around, in this case, language and hyperactivity, then sharing those concerns in writing with the school then puts the responsibility in the school's hands, because they are obligated to assess in all areas of suspected disability. So you would write a letter requesting an assessment, explaining what those areas of concern are, and how you feel they're impacting your child at school, right? Because it's an educational benefit. Is it impacting their ability to access their education, to make progress in the general ed curriculum? How is that concern impacting them? And then remember, the reason assessments are important is because they're objective sources of information. It's an objective evaluation. It's not people sitting around guessing at what's going on and giving their opinions. You're actually, doing an objective measurement and bringing it to the IEP team to discuss what the results were and what the recommendations are from that assessment. So that was one question I got, and then one other I'm going to get to before I give Mary some time to answer questions. Another parent said, must all assessments be considered? So in her case, it sounds like she had her child was assessed by a certified audiologist, to test for central auditory processing disorder. And she was wondering, does that constitute an educational assessment, or what makes an educational assessment that versus medical versus any number of types of assessments, right? So first things first, if you as parents have an assessment that you have done outside of the school district, which many of us have, that you feel that the team needs to see and consider because you feel that what's being assessed in that particular report, or what the area of concern was and the recommendations, directly impact your student at school. And again, back to, is it impacting, you know, their ability to access their education, right? Is it impacting their ability to make progress in the general ed curriculum? For any reason, if you think that the outside assessment should be seen by the IEP team, then by all means, have an IEP team meeting, bring it to the team. The federal law requires IEP teams to consider the results of all assessments. So they all have an obligation to consider those assessments. Consider does not mean agreeing to it 100% and saying, oh, great, okay, this child has a medical diagnosis and therefore we're gonna take that assessment and turn it into IEP goals, and we think it's, we're gonna apply everything that the recommendations are saying. No, it just means consider, but it doesn't mean dismiss it either. So if an assessment that you shared somehow related to the school and related to how your child is at school and their access to school and their education, social emotional well-being at school, any number of things, then in central auditory processing disorder, if they're having trouble understanding what they're hearing, that's most likely going to be impacting them at school, academically, possibly socially, any number of ways. And so it is important to bring that to the team, and the team does have that legal obligation to discuss and consider that assessment, and then hopefully the results of that would then enable the team to develop the appropriate goals. And we'll get into this next week because goals drive everything, but they are based on assessments. All right, Mary, I'll turn it over to you. You're muted.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, why don't schools have an obligation to accept independent assessments and medical diagnosis, especially as they may help the student in a learning environment? Well, as Jennifer was saying, they have to consider outside information. There is no definition of what consider means exactly, but the condition has to have an adverse effect on the student's learning. If it does not affect the student negatively at school, that doesn't guarantee that your child will get an IEP or get services in that area. Like say, for example, as Jonathan talked earlier about gifted and talented, there's a term called twice exceptional. If you have a twice exceptional student who is really, really smart, has a really high IQ, but also has dyslexia, and then the teachers and the testing show that that child is still functioning at grade level, even though not working to his or her potential because they're genius, they're not going to get an IEP for dyslexia or for specific learning disability. And then question number 2, during the assessment process, are teachers qualified to give opinions on diagnosable conditions without a proper understanding of what the condition is? For example, can a teacher suggest a student has oppositional defiance disorder and ADHD without really understanding what those conditions are, just because the child has behavior issues, and especially when there are other conditions which have similar symptoms and behaviors but are completely different in diagnosis and treatment? These comments by the teacher then form part of the official assessment and the student's record, but yet have no scientific or medical basis. No, teachers cannot diagnose ADD, ADHD, or ODD or anything else unless they're also a school psychologist or have a medical degree or something. However, teachers are considered to be reliable reporters on behaviors and attention in students. And teachers are part of the IEP team, and as such should be given behavior rating scales to fill out regarding the behaviors, and also describe the behaviors that they see in school, but not diagnose them. They can tell you what they notice, and they can recommend that you have your child evaluated, but they are not qualified to make a diagnosis and should not be diagnosing the student. They should be describing the behaviors and voicing their concerns, but should not be diagnosing. When assessing children, is the onus on the school to get the assessment correct? If the school is going to assess and then label a child, shouldn't they have a responsibility to ensure that that assessment is accurate? Incorrect labeling of students can be detrimental to their physiological well-being, can lead to wrong strategies being taught, and effective IEP goals, as well as becoming part of a student's educational record. What can a parent do if they feel the diagnosis assessment results are not correct? In that situation, a parent should definitely request an independent evaluation at public expense, because wrong placement of a child and getting a wrong diagnosis can harm that child over years, and also prevent that child from making progress and learning. And it's very important to have an assessment that has correct information. Do you want me to keep going, Jennifer? Hello?
Yeah, go for it. Unless you want to switch. Yeah, just go for it.
No, okay. My child won't go to school in person during fall, and we have a doctor's note to excuse him, but he's in the middle of occupational therapy and functional behavior assessments at school. Can those be continued while he's staying at home and still doing school online? The occupational therapy assessment definitely can be continued while he's staying at home. There's conflicting information, and I'm currently seeking guidance as far as getting assessments completed right now goes. But yes, if the OT is willing to go to your house, or if you can find a private OT that the district is willing to contract with to finish that assessment, that can be done. As far as the FBA goes, that's a little bit trickier, because I'm assuming that you were trying to get information regarding your child's behavior in the classroom and functioning in the classroom, which is impossible to do in the home because it's two different environments. If you're seeing the same behavioral issues at home, there are some BCBAs, board certified behavior analysts, who are going into clients' homes and still doing ABA services during this time. Having said that, given the current situation, I think that there's a shortage, because employers cannot force the employees to go into a student's home right now if they don't want to, due to exposure to COVID-19. But like I said as well, if the behaviors are in the classroom and not in the home, then that's probably going to have to wait. But if you're seeing it in both places, then I would press to go ahead and get it done, especially since your child is going to be staying home for a while. And then when you get to the assessments discussion, a couple bullet points our families would love to see covered. Number one, most of Monterey County's large districts have blatantly stopped doing assessments once schools closed in March. In the fall, there's going to be a significant number that will need to be conducted, and there will be a limited number of evaluators. How can a parent ensure that their child will be assessed in a timely manner? That's a good question, and there's, like I said, a lack of guidance as far as that goes right now. The governor has waived the 15-day timeline to get initial assessment plans to parents, but has not waived the timeline to complete assessments. And I think the assumption is that that timeline has stopped, It's 60 days, according to IDEA, to complete the assessments once the assessment plan is signed. And I think the assumption is that that has stopped since schools have since schools were closed on March 17th. However, schools didn't close. They moved to a different format. And we're still teaching, we're still getting paid. And so I think we need guidance in that area. And I'm in the process of trying to submit guidance to get that. So, but in the meantime, just, keep in contact with your school, keep emailing, keep calling, saying, when is my child going to be assessed? And I also know that there are private assessors out there who are doing assessments, some face-to-face, wearing masks and being safe. And also the governor has mandated that school psychologists and assessors are essential workers. So that means that they can continue to work during this time. And then where should a parent go if they want to have their child assessed this summer by an independent evaluator? If your insurance will cover it, then that's great. But if not, you're going to have to find somebody who's open and doing it. There's places up in San Jose and in the Bay Area that I know are up and still doing assessments, but I can't recommend any particular place or person. And then available study devices for special needs kids who are nonverbal. If you have a special needs child who is nonverbal and you are looking for study devices or any type of device to help your child be verbal, then you need to get a speech evaluation, and also an augmentative communication and alternative communication assessment, which is, it's referred to as an AAC, and get some recommendations from a good speech therapist who is qualified and knowledgeable about what is out there as far as augmentative communication devices go. And that's it.
We have about just a few minutes left. We had a ton of questions come in the chat box that I know we didn't get to, and we can't answer all of them. And so we will try to get to the ones we haven't answered and summarize them in an email that we'll send out to everyone. We have a few more minutes, so I want to just say that there is a poll up on your screen. If you can respond to that, that would be fantastic. It's just a way for us to get some feedback about the training or about the workshop. Also know that we have the additional workshops coming up. One builds upon the other. So again, that June one was about data collection and compensatory services, just to jump into that stuff that was on everyone's mind then. And then we covered assessments today, and next week is the IEP part 1, and the following week IEP part 2. The week after that would be on due process compliance complaints, and then the week after that will be much more time dedicated to Q&A and trying to figure out what things look like in the upcoming school year, and addressing concerns around that. I wanted to say that we did receive several questions that had to do with behaviors and behavior concerns and behavior plans not working. And as a result of receiving those questions, we were talking and we thought, oh, we should probably hold a webinar about that sometime. So look for more information about that probably in the fall sometime. We will be looking to host either a single webinar or a series focused on the behavior needs of students in special education. But I can say that, if you have a student with a behavior plan and it's not working, because that was several of the questions, that from my experience, it's normally a result of the plan itself wasn't thorough enough, or something was up with the plan. Or the staff who are supposed to be implementing the plan weren't trained adequately. And then the third variable is sometimes plans are not implemented consistently, and that can definitely impact the efficacy of a behavior plan too. So those are just 3 reasons that are off the top of my head. Jonathan, did you want to have anything to add, any questions you wanted to
the last question that I had that was kind of interesting is asking for parent assessment in this process. And when we look towards the normed assessment, like the Key Math 3 that I keep on holding up, that is typically a one-on-one setting where the child should be alone with the assessor as to follow the test rules and to get valid assessments. And for our last webinar, we did have a document that had links to assessments that parents can give themselves. These are curriculum-based assessments to allow parents to figure out where their child is now, with the title of the last webinar, and to start that communication and process with the school district. So if you want to do some of this yourself, you are able to give your children spelling words, math problems, information that you can communicate to the school of, hey, my child can do multiplication problems, but can't do division yet. That is very functional, and that's information that can be used to turn around and write goals, and then determine if a triennial assessment is needed earlier. And in that document, there's reading assessments, spelling assessments, math assessments, some language assessments that parents can give themselves without having to have a professional degree to administer.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. It is 2:32. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you for your feedback. And please, you have our contact information for all of us. And thank you to Stella for interpreting as well. I know that's not an easy job, especially when I, for one, talk too fast. And we look forward to, seeing you guys in the upcoming webinars. And of course, feel free to follow us up with any questions that we didn't get to. I will try to put together a Q&A document. This is what I did last time when we ran out of time for questions. Putting your questions in, putting our answers in, and then sharing it with all of you guys. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.